Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic for you today. Let's do it. People who work in morgues or with the dead. What's the creepiest thing you've ever experienced? Serious. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
My fiancée died 6 days before our wedding. That morning I tried to wake her up, and when I noticed she wasn't responding, I attempted to find a pulse and perform CPR. When I was doing CPR, she started wheezing, but it was only me pushing the air from her lungs. When I checked for a pulse, I accidentally had my thumb on her neck and felt my own pulse, and I had a glimmer of hope that I had somehow managed to revive her, even though in hindsight, it was obvious she had passed on already, only to have my heart ripped out again in an instant when she wasn't moving or breathing. I had only performed CPR in training courses, but never on a person, and I had absolutely no idea what to expect when pressing on someone's chest that hard. It's only been 3 months, and no answers as to how she died, but now every time I wheeze post-COVID asthmatic, the PTSD strikes, and I relive the moment of finding my love and the mother of our 2-year-old dead. If someone's been down for more than a day or two, they'll start decomposing from the inside out. If the room is quiet enough, you can hear lots of gurgling and rumbling as the gases and fluids are moving around inside, and then you move them and they groan as the residual air in their lungs is forced out past their vocal cords. My wife is a mortician. She's had quite a lot of wacky experiences. This is more funny than creepy, but once she was trying to break up the rigor mortis in a decedent's hip by flexing the entire leg up. Her grip slipped and the leg swung down, the heel cracking her right in the face, resulting in a black eye. She had to explain to people that she's not in an abusive relationship. She just got kicked in the face by a dead guy. I don't work in a morgue or with the dead, but I unexpectedly lost both my moms in 2020 and my closest sister in 2022. When my mom passed, my sister was the first to discover her. By the time I got to the house, EMTs had tried to revive her and failed, and she was still wearing a plastic mask of some kind in her mouth that some emergency tubing had been attached to. We called a priest for final rites, Catholic family, and my uncle and I had to pick her up from the floor to get her on the bed. We almost slipped, and I remember that her head kind of whipped back and her teeth made this awful, dull, clacking sound against the plastic aperture of the mask. It simultaneously creeped me out and made me even sadder that she had to undergo such indignities and death. With my sister, I was the one to discover that she died in her sleep, same house. I didn't have a key to the door, and I'm a big guy, and couldn't get through her bedroom window. She wasn't responding to my yells, so I grabbed a brick from the little flower bed out front and dropped it through the window and onto her leg. It twitched a little bit, which gave me a moment's hope, but nothing else happened, and it was discovered when the EMTs got there that she'd been gone for hours. I can still see it in my mind's eye, that twitch.
It's a terrible thing to have experienced, and I'm sorry for your 2 huge losses. I hope you're doing a little bit better.
People who had been on blood thinner medication before they died can make for an odd scene. Saw a guy that had died looking out of his window, so he was discovered with his head on the windowsill, and there was this thick column of jellied blood from his nose to the floor. It was a bit freaky. I spent 3 years working in a New York City ER. On the 4th of July one year, it was a pleasantly slow day, as holidays typically are. We had a red phone that EMS would call to let us know about a patient coming in, maybe a heart attack or a stroke or someone actively getting CPR, usually about 5 to 10 minutes out. This day, I picked up the phone and dispatch said a gunshot victim was coming in. We're not a level 1 trauma hospital, so getting a gunshot victim is exceedingly rare. It means they are nearby and on the brink of death, so they can't afford the time to go to the trauma center. No ETA on this guy. Well, after I hung up, EMS was rolling in doing compressions. Very, very few people survive a cardiac arrest due to trauma. His odds were not in his favor, and after opening his chest up to plug the holes in the heart, we called it. He was gone. He didn't have any ID on him, so we had no way of even identifying him or contacting family. It was the first time I'd ever been in an active crime scene. A homicide investigation began to unfold. It was surreal, having to allow men in suits to take photos of my patient. I go on my lunch break and have my ceremonial McDonald's after a difficult case. I come back and thankfully homicide is done with the ER and he's in the morgue. A bit later, we found out the police figured out this guy's identity, which was a huge relief to us. Later on, my charge nurse informs me that homicide tried to go to our morgue, but there was no body. Truly, they searched everywhere. His body was gone. About 3 surreal hours later, we found out that there's a separate morgue for unidentified patients. They were looking in the wrong morgue, and we didn't know it for 3 hours. But for those 3 Schrodinger cat hours, we had lost a homicide victim's body. Sometimes when people have died and we turn them over to clean and dress them, they still have air in their lungs and will make grunting noises when moved. Scared the crap out of me the first time I experienced it. Not necessarily the creepiest thing, but the funeral home I worked for liked to embalm as soon as possible after death. I had embalmed a man that was dead for less than 30 minutes to an hour. He was still warm, and rigor had not set in yet. I kinda just held his hand for a minute before I got started. I got punched in the balls by a dead guy. I used to work hospital security. Part of our job was to help with 1080 assists, movement of bodies to and out of the morgue. I was on a call to move one, and the body's limbs were sticking out at odd, stiff angles. I attempted to move the corpse's arm into a better spot to shimmy the bag into the body fridge. His arm stayed in place for a moment, but when I released my grip, smack, old buddy hit me right in the sack.
Now, granted, it might have absolutely sucked in the moment when it happened, but you have a story to tell for the rest of your life that will probably always get a laugh. So, I'm sorry, but you're welcome.
My first job was at a cemetery. We had a common burial, someone who could not afford a casket or vault. They provided a wood frame and cardboard casket. We dug the hole the night before. It rained heavily that night. The next day, after the ceremony, we lowered the casket into the water-filled hole. It just floated on top. So we used a backhoe bucket to push it down. The casket fell apart, and the body slid out and floated. We pushed her down and filled the hole. I protested, but was told this is how things were done. I still feel bad about it. Rotated through the forensic path lab during medical school. Ended up seeing and participating in the autopsy of a high school classmate. It was completely without knowing at the time. Years later, no similar resemblance, but then I saw posts on Facebook about him later that day, and it put me in the worst funk for a solid week or 2. All these posts about him, and there I was with his brain in my hands. My creepiest moment was when I was in the morgue by myself at 4 a.m. I was using the lift to put the body into a crypt. It had reached roughly eye level when the power went out. It is now pitch dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Then all the fans died, and all I could hear was the crinkling of body bags. That's when I started to hear disembodied voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying or where they were coming from. The power comes back a few moments later on, and I move on with my night. Turns out the voices were just the automated, "The power has gone out, switching to generator power" message. Haha. My buddy worked at a crematorium, and after burning the bodies, they would have to rake out the stuff that doesn't burn, like hip replacements and stuff like that. I can't for the life of me remember what they did with gold fillings, removed before or after. Pacemakers were removed before burning, I'm pretty sure. A lot of this stuff would be recycled for precious metals. Not human corpses, but I worked as a sea otter conservationist, and we'd have to recover carcasses off the coast of California for research. We'd seal them in black bags and put them in a freezer after the autopsy, but sometimes the gas buildup would cause them to squeal and involuntarily move around when they're fresh. This movement can trigger other carcasses under them in the freezer who are on the brink of gas buildup to do the same. That shit was some nightmare fuel. I'm late. The other day, our motion lights were on in the embalming room. I was the only one in the funeral home and had not gone in the room all day. Also, last week we had a power outage. Then all of a sudden, with the power out, our iPad dead, and our music system off, loud music blared through the speakers. It was at top volume. We've never turned the music up that loud. Plus it was playing with no power. Again, I was alone in the funeral home. Not a morgue worker, but I watched my father die in the hospital. A bad fall led to an unsurvivable brain damage. He was there for about 6 days, only 60 years old. We nor he wanted him on machines, so when the time came to take him off life support, his breathing turned to gargling after a quick heart attack according to the ECG, exactly like the sound of someone hitting a big bong. I couldn't smoke one for a while after the sound. And right before I left the room, I gave him a last kiss on his forehead. It felt like he had worms wriggling around under his skin, and his eyebrows started to twitch a little, like he was raising and lowering his brows. He was gone at that point too. No brain activity, no heartbeat, yet his fine muscles were twitching anyway. I think the nurse said it was the muscles, straining from no oxygen. It was disturbing, to say the least. Effed up enough 2 years later, I have to suddenly put my 11-year-old lab down, and the service we were going to do home euthanasia with was somehow booked and couldn't help us, nor could many others. So I had to find some new random vet to take care of it. I'm a mess. My dog was scared, in pain, and in a completely new place, with me a semi-useless, sobbing pile. The vet was wonderful, and left him with me till I was ready to let him go. And when the tech picked his body up, he made the sound he made when I wouldn't give him more treats. All I could do was whimper, "Wait, is he?" And the vet ran back over to me to show he was gone, and it was just air escaping. I hate to be like this, but I don't know which was worse. A friend of mine told me this story ages ago, and I hope I remember it well enough. When he was 18, he worked for a single plane transporter contractor, and one time they had to carry a body. It wasn't autopsied or prepared for funeral yet. That was where they were taking it. So it was wrapped and just sort of laying on the floor. Now when you're in the air, I'm sure other pilots will tell you, the rise and fall of the airplane will do strange things with gravity, air pressure, and necromancy. In any case, the corpse had enough air in its lungs that the lower pressure outside the body caused the air inside to be expelled, slowly, and through the larynx. Meanwhile, rise and fall of the plane caused the body to sit up and the wrapping to fall away. Sitting up caused it to expel more air from the lungs. So while flying a dead body in the plane, they heard a long, low moan and saw a dead body sit up in the back of the plane. The pilot panicked, left the controls, and ran back and punched the corpse across the face, knocking it back down. He told me about how they figured out what had happened, but I was laughing too hard at that point to really pick up the details. I do remember that they had to explain the additional damage to the corpse when they arrived at their destination.
Again, another one where slightly more lighthearted, if you can call that, but the idea, the image of a pilot getting up and punching a corpse in the face that happened to sit up mid-flight, probably get a laugh. So, respectfully, of course.
I was observing an autopsy for a forensic dentistry class. The pathologist was an older lady with gray hair swept up into a bun. She informed us that she would not be using gloves, as she had never used gloves. Keep in mind, this was in the late 80s when HIV and AIDS was incurable. The patient was a murder victim, gunshot. He had knocked on a door in a sketchy part of New Orleans, and by the time the homeowner opened the door, he was dead on the front porch. Her assistant was named James and was wearing a leather butcher apron, but he was wearing gloves. During the thoracic examination, the pathologist put her ungloved hands into the clotted blood in the chest and was squeezing the clotted blood between her fingers, saying, "Gotta find that bullet, James." She had blood up to her elbows. I glanced over into the corner of the room, and James was smoking a cigarette with his bloody gloves. It was so surreal, like a weird, creepy movie.